Hello, I'm Peter Russell, and I'd like to welcome you to this fourth program in our series, in which we are looking at the times we are passing through and their significance for us as human beings and the demands they're making of us, and maybe some of the changes we can make in our own lives to actually live happier, healthier lives in these times. In previous programs, we've looked at what we can do to improve our creativity and also help ourselves manage stress and pressure better. In this program, we're going to be looking more at the environmental crisis that is affecting all of humanity at these current times, and begin to ask, what can we do in ourselves to actually live more lightly on the planet? And what are some of the inner changes we need to make in our own lives? And as before in the studio, I'm joined by Matea, Tony, Vida, and Jerry, who will be joining me in discussion. Now, I think to start with, why don't I just say a little bit more about the environmental crisis and why I think that it actually reflects changes that we need to make inside us. I think if we look around us, we can see a lot that's going wrong in the world in terms of the way we're polluting the planet, losing topsoil at a fantastic rate. I think it's something like 25 billion tons of soil are lost each year. The way we're destroying the forests, destroying the ozone layer, which could have a profound effect not only on us, but on all life on Earth. And the question that I continually ask myself is, why is it that a species that calls itself so intelligent, we like to think ourselves as the most intelligent species on this planet, how is it we can behave in such insane ways? So I think if you think about it, to realize we are destroying our environment and perhaps destroying ourselves in the process, and then to continue doing so is insane. I think a lot of people have looked at this, and one thing that's clear is a lot of it comes down to human greed, our love of money. So many crazy decisions seem to be made in the name of money or people's power, political power, these sorts of issues. And all of these, to me, seem to come back to our self-interest. Human beings seem to be very selfish, self-interested creatures. And I know Arthur Koestler, who we mentioned in an earlier program, looked at this and he said, maybe we're inherently self-interested and maybe there's nothing we can do. He was suggesting perhaps apart from brain surgery. But I think it isn't that so much that we're inherently self-interested, so much as our self-interest has got shifted in the wrong direction. Because if you think about it, we all need self-interest. If we weren't self-interested, as animals, we wouldn't make sure we had enough food to eat. We wouldn't keep ourselves alive. So self-interest on one level is very good. I think where we've gone wrong is in our society, we have forgotten what our true self-interest is. It's as if we are being told the whole time by the media, by advertising, by schools, education, by our parents, that our true self-interest is something out there. It's what we have or do. And I think that's important in terms of having enough food to eat and housing and clothing, all the basic necessities of life. I think what's happened in our society is we are told that if we've got all those things, then we should have even more of those things. And I think our true self-interest, and this is what we've forgotten, is to be more at peace in ourselves. Underlying everything, we want to feel good inside. And that basically is why we eat when we're hungry, because hunger is an uncomfortable experience, and by eating, we feel good again. And this, I think, is the fundamental motivation of all human beings, probably all creatures in the universe, is to avoid pain and suffering and to come to a state of feeling good inside ourselves. In fact, that's how we know, I think, as creatures, if we're surviving well. If we're feeling good, we know we're doing okay. If we're in suffering or pain, there's something that needs to change. But I think what's happened is, when we're suffering today, and we think something needs to change, we think it's something outside. So if we're unhappy or depressed, the typical reaction is to think, I've got to do something. You know, we go and buy ourselves some new clothes or something like that. And it works for a little while. You go and buy yourself a new jacket or a new pair of shoes, and you may feel good for a few days or a few weeks if you're lucky, but then the effect wears off and you have to go and buy something else and buy something else. So I think this is one of the reasons we keep on consuming more than we need to consume, because we're continually looking for something outside ourselves, when in fact it's inside ourselves. And there's a lovely Sufi story which I think demonstrates this. It's the story of Nasruddin, who is what's called a wise fool. He appears to be foolish, but there's a lot of wisdom in his actions or his teachings. And in this story, one day Nasruddin is found out on the street at night on his hands and knees underneath a street lamp looking for something. And a friend comes along and says, what have you lost? Can I help you? And he says, well, I've lost my key. And so his friend said, okay, I'll help you find it. And they're looking around on the ground, and after about 10 minutes, they still haven't found it. And so the friend says, well, tell me, where exactly did you lose it? And Nasruddin said, oh, I lost it inside my house. And so the friend says, well, excuse me, but what on earth are you doing looking for it out here? And Nasruddin says, well, there's more light out here. Now, that, I mean, you laugh, it sounds silly, but in a sense, I think that's what we're doing a lot of the time in our lives. The key we're looking for is how can we feel happier, more comfortable, more peaceful inside ourselves. And we're looking for it out there in terms of what we have, what we do, partly because there's more light out there. We know how to manage the world around us. We know how, these days, with our technology and science, to create almost anything we could dream of. Not quite yet, but almost anything. So we've got so good at managing the world outside, we think this is the answer to everything. And it's certainly the answer to our physical needs, but it's not the answer, I don't think, to our deeper psychological needs. And so I think this is the shift that we need to make today, is to realize that having achieved a certain level of material satisfaction, progress, the next step is to turn inwards rather than go on looking outwardly. And I think that's the positive side of the environmental crisis. That's what it's pointing out to us, the need to make that sort of shift. Now, I know, Vida, you're an active environmentalist, active in the world trying to change things. How do you see this dynamic between the inner and the outer?
Well, I must very much agree, especially with this last point that you made, that now the crisis is forcing us to do this. Because also with the research that's being done, for example, life cycle analysis and the results that come is showing us that we have to produce things as energy efficient and as resource efficient as possible. So I think that if we are doing things within us, this is the most energy and resource efficient activity that we can possibly undertake. That also goes in direction of investment, where can invest money, whether it is in research that has to do within us or activities outside and the consequences out on the world. But I do think that there is still a lot we need to do out there in the material world, and I realize the importance of what you are saying. But I still think that as we are running against such a powerful presence of the capital and the media and advertising, just if we think that in 1990 about 250 billion were spent worldwide on advertising, which is about $50 per person on this planet, I think this is so enormous, as you were saying, a means of hypnotizing us constantly. So this pressure is constantly running against what you're just saying.
Yeah.
So how to resist this pressure, I think, is maybe a question that I have for you.
Well, I think you're right in terms of advertising is part of this hypnosis. In a way, if you look at it, most advertisements are saying, if you buy this product or this service or whatever it is that's being advertised, buy this and you will be happier.
Right.
And I sometimes think, half seriously, but also there's a serious bit to it, as well as jokingly, that I think all advertisements should have a little health warning, like cigarette advertisements do in many Western countries, that says smoking is dangerous for your health. I think all other advertisements should say, yes, buy this product or this service and you will be happier, but it won't last for long. The effect will soon wear off. I think what you're pointing out is this belief system, and that's what it is, it's a belief system we've got hypnotized into, that says, basically, if you're not happy, if you've got your physical needs met and you're still not happy, you need to do even more, runs throughout our society. And that's what runs so much of the capitalist society, I think all societies, apart from maybe some of the very simple hunter-gatherer societies living in maybe the rainforest don't have this belief, but so many others, I think you see this in the third world. People want to have Sony Walkmans and all these extra things because they believe if only I had this, I would be happy. And that's the belief system that's continually being reinforced. I say it's not just advertising as a major part of it, but I think it's throughout our culture.
I think there is something else, though. I think it's also the fact that now the consequences of our activities have become so complex and also spread over a longer period of time, which earlier was not the case. Just the technology allows us to do that, that we cannot possibly see the whole picture.
Right.
We see a very narrow segment, so if we do buy a new car, we do not experience or we do not see the consequences of our purchase. And of course, the advertising industry would never want us to really see the whole picture.
Right.
So I think it was educational when the Time had this magazine declaring Earth as the planet of the year a few years ago, and still the magazine was full of car advertisements in there, which were completely out of context.
Yeah.
But the connection is not made somehow. Like, these are the environmental issues, and this is our everyday life.
I think that there's two factors behind the environmental issue. One is our overpopulation, and the second is our overconsumption, that people in the West, the more developed countries at least, and Western Europe, USA, are consuming far more than they actually need. And I think what I'm saying is, if we're going to reduce this consumption, I think we have to. You can do it two ways. You can either say, you can pass a law saying you mustn't drive a car that's bigger than 1 litre capacity or something, or you can try to help people see that they don't actually need these things and that maybe they'd be happier without them. I mean, some of the unhappiest people I've met have been some of the richest people in America. They've got all the money, everything they could want externally, and they're going through their third divorce and worrying about this and that. They are some of the unhappiest people on this planet.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I got a feeling that you two were talking constantly about consumption first, as a first problem. I would like to ask something about consumption, because you see, speaking ecologically, the first topic for every species is to survive and have offspring.
Yes.
And when we are talking about surviving, when we are talking about having children, who has the right to decide how many is enough? Because you see, wealth or plentiness is a relative thing. Plentiness can seem to be a great poverty compared with extreme wealth.
I think, this is an interesting question. It depends which country you're asking this from. If you're living, say, in an African country, it may be very important for your survival to have as many children as possible, because you know half of them are going to die in childhood, and as you grow old, there's no pensions, you want to have children look after you. But that's a very different situation than maybe what's happening in the Western countries, the more developed countries, where having children is just increasing the population and doesn't help you at all. And I don't think anybody has the right to tell you, and that's what I'm saying, I don't think we should pass laws like they have in China, where they said just one child, although that certainly helped China control its population. I think it should be an individual choice. And I think once one has satisfied one's basic needs, I agree, the first thing is we need to survive. We need to make sure we have adequate food, housing, clothes, all the basic necessities and basic comforts of life. But then we have to tell ourselves when to stop. I think that's not only consumption, but when we stop with children. And so I think it's a choice which individuals make. And as our awareness is growing about the effect of population, I think more and more people who have risen above the poverty level are beginning to make that choice. I think that's where the change has to come. I don't think it's about Western nations telling the third world or Eastern Europe how they should behave. I think the example has to come from the West, because that's where the major consumption is happening.
Well, there's another thing I would like to ask, because you see, in Western world, at least for 20 years, the awareness of ecological crisis is quite present. And still, it doesn't seem that something really changes in the behavior of these people of these countries.
Yes.
So what do you think, how many time does it need to make a change or to change values in people?
I don't know. I wish it wasn't so much. I think it comes back to this basic belief system at the moment. People in the West, they don't want to give up their comforts. I mean, I had an interesting experience a little while ago. I was in Dallas in Texas in the United States. And I was talking on the radio about the environmental crisis. And people started calling me on the telephone saying, there is no environmental crisis. It's a conspiracy. There is no scientific evidence for it whatsoever. And I was shocked by this. And as I explored it with them, the bottom line, what it came down to is, don't tell me I have to change my lifestyle. Don't tell me to drive a smaller car or give up having so much air conditioning. Now, all the time that we believe that these things, big cars, fancy air conditioning, whatever it is, all the time we believe that's important for our well-being, we won't give them up easily. We'll have to have them taken away from us. And maybe the only way they'll be taken away is by an environmental catastrophe, whereby people cannot buy gas to drive their cars. I think if we realize that maybe we don't need them, then I think we can make the choice to let go and say, hang on, why am I driving this big car? I don't need it. And I could actually be happier, there's less responsibility maybe with a smaller car. So I think that's why this shift of consciousness has to happen at the same time as we're doing all we can at the external level.
Do you think, I'm sorry,
Matea?
do you think that's in human nature to resist change, that we are not willing to do it, or why you were all discussing about what we should do in environmental issues, but actually what is really going on, what is it?
I think that comes down a lot of it to fear. I think we fear change, and we fear it. I think that's why we resist it, and we fear that, maybe we will fail if things change at work, or we fear changing our lives because either we feel insecure or because we feel we won't be as happy. I think that's the real bottom line. We think, if this change happens, I will not be so happy. And that's why we resist change. If a change comes where we know we're going to be happier for it, then we make that change. If someone meets somebody and falls in love and decides this person is going to make them happy, they make a major change in their life and they get married and all those things. They're making a huge change because they believe they're going to be happier for it. And I think this is what's underneath the resistance to change, is we fear that in one way or another this change will not make us happier. And so I think that's what we need to bring out to people more, that maybe the sorts of changes we're asking people to make, we will actually be happier in the long term. You were about to say something, Jerry.
Right, actually I have two questions. They may be connected somehow. First is, why are some people more resistant to change than others? And this ties in with hypnosis also, I think. Why are some people more easily hypnotized than others about the whole attachment to material comforts in society? And secondly, if somehow in the West, at least, people miraculously were to realize they didn't need so much products to consume, what effect would that have on the economy? Wouldn't we be creating an economic disaster, which would put people massively out of work and create a crisis situation, which would result in people, again, thinking of themselves first and their own survival instincts and what's necessary to obtain their the necessities in life?
I think they're two huge questions.
Okay.
I don't think we can really get to the roots of either of them, but I mean, my views very briefly on that, and maybe you have views as well, is I think the whole question of why some people are more easily hypnotized, and we're not just talking about hypnosis in a scientific laboratory, we're talking about the sort of hypnosis we're all in our society, in terms of our beliefs of what is important. I think it's probably very complex, many different reasons, but I think one factor may well be what's happened to us in our early life, because one of the things that seems to be true of hypnosis is that the people who are more easily hypnotized in the laboratory are people who are more willing to go along with suggestion. And maybe they're more willing because they don't want to upset the hypnotist. They want to be approved of. And I think maybe this is true in life, that the people who go along with the social hypnosis do it because they want to be part of the crowd. They don't want to stand out. And that may come back to what happened to us very early on. If you had a very nurturing, loving childhood, you may feel much stronger and independent as a person, and so not so easily go along with the crowd. Somebody who didn't get enough love or something else happened in their childhood, they may be much more needy of the support of the group. And it's that neediness that maybe weakens them, so that when an advertisement comes on the television and say, buy this pair of jeans and you will be part of the party, they say, yes, I must have that. They haven't got the inner strength to say, hey, that's ridiculous. So I think that's what we need, is the inner strength more. I think the second question about, you were saying if people change and don't consume so much, wouldn't this bring the end of Western economy?
If we did accomplish the goal in this matter, if people did change their attitudes, how would that affect the economic climate in the West, and what effect would that have long term?
I think, you're pointing out that it would be the end of our economic model. My view is the current economic model that seems to be driving the world, which is basically a capitalist model, which has been exported now over most of the world, and we see Eastern Europe and Russia trying to take it on, and we're exporting it to the third world. I think that model has to come to an end. It's going to come to an end sooner or later. We've seen the fall of the communist economic system, and people in America think, ha-ha, capitalism won. I don't think it's that way at all. I think communism fell first, capitalism will fall second. And what is clear is that economic model is based upon the idea of growth, continual economic growth. You hear, you go into any country and you see people say, economy growing at 0.5% a month, very good, or if the economy is only growing at 0.1% a month, bad. We have this idea that economic growth is good. But what modern economics doesn't do is really look at the long-term consequences. If you take a 5% economic growth per year and you extrapolate that, it's on an exponential curve, and after something like 20, 30 years, you're talking about a 300% growth in the economy. Now, growth in the economy at the moment means quite a growth in production, which means a growth in consumption of resources, which means a growth in pollution as well. At the moment, human beings on this planet account for something like 40% of the use of the land mass of the Earth. 40% of the land is given over to supply human beings. If we double our consumption, which is very likely over the next, say, 20 years, that'll mean 80% of the Earth is consumed by humanity. We can't go much further than that. So at that point, the economic model has to change. So I think the question is, can we change the economic model consciously and find a way to get away from this notion of continual growth? Because on a finite planet, you cannot have continual unchecked growth. But because everybody's looking very short term, they're looking at the next year and these markets and at their own individual needs, their own national needs, or that company's needs, or that person's needs, we don't stop to think about economic growth. So I think the current economic model has to end. So if we stop consuming so much, then maybe that will allow the model to change more smoothly, because it will adjust to the change rather than being a major collapse of the whole system.
So does it mean like the inner process and the outer one must run at the same time?
I think so, yes. I think, and this has really been a theme very much of all of this series, is there's a lot of things we need to do in the external world. But I think if we are to really make those changes successful in the long term, there's a lot we need to do in terms of ourselves on the inside as well. So we need to bring both of those changes together.
Okay, we've made a trip through economics, but what's really interesting is, can you tell us a bit more about how can we make this inner change?
Yeah, yes.
Or how can we achieve it?
Maybe the issue, yes, meditation, what is it?
I think there's many, many different ways. You mentioned meditation. I think meditation is a practice which exists in most cultures, in most spiritual traditions, and what meditation is doing is allowing people to actually settle down, to come to a state of quiet and realize they can be at peace in the middle of a busy world. They don't need to be continually doing this or doing that. Because what people say about meditation is it's a state of inner peace. So that's one thing, is meditation. I think we can also, in our own lives, begin to ask ourselves some very important questions. I think, first of all, to realize that what we're each looking for is how can we be at peace? And then to say, if I find myself wanting a certain thing, say I want to have a new coat, and I see this new coat advertised, and I think, oh, I haven't got the money to buy it, but I need to get hold of it, all that thing. We can drive ourselves crazy inside wanting this coat, and that's making ourselves unhappy. And what we can say to ourselves is, first of all, if I did have this coat, would I really be happy? The answer might be for a few days, but would I really be at peace? And if we begin to realize, hang on, no, it's just an illusion. If we can break that illusion of thinking, if only I had this, and it's not just coats, it's our relationships, or many different things, the same model applies. And I think the second question we can ask ourselves is, even if I don't have that thing that is not absolutely necessary, can I still be at peace? And the answer is probably yes. Because this question of, which we talked about in other programs, of how we see things, that determines whether or not we're at peace. So I think that's another shift we can continually practice making in our own life, is how can we change the way we see things so that we can be more at peace in ourselves.
But does that mean like giving up wishes, or just being comfortable with the other idea as well? It's not just, that you stop wanting, or that we stop wishing things.
No, it isn't that. I think it's a very subtle difference. It was pointed out by an American psychologist a few years ago. It's the difference between an attachment, which is almost like an addiction of thinking, I have to have something. If I don't have it, I will be miserable. Instead of thinking I have to have it, is to change the word to prefer. I prefer to have it. I would prefer to have a nice coat, or whatever it is, but if I don't have that nice coat, I can still be happy. So it's a shift in attitude from having to have something, which is the attachment, to actually preferring to have it. So you can still have desires, but you don't make yourself miserable if you don't have them. And also, if you realize that having this desire is going to, create more consumption on the planet, then you can say, let me not have that. Maybe I don't need a fur coat because it's killing foxes. That's not a good thing. I can be free in myself. And I think that's what we're talking about in all these programs, in terms of the creativity, in terms of the stress, is how can we actually be more free in ourselves? And what I want to do in the final program is look more into the future. We're going to be looking more at technology, how that's developing, how that's bringing us all together, the information technology, and looking at where that's taking us, and then asking, what does that mean in terms of our more personal human relationships? So I think one thing we've seen in this program is something we've been seeing in all the programs, is that we are in a major crisis. The world is changing very fast, and there are some things we can do, certainly some things we can do to help this be a better world, but there's also a lot we can do for ourselves. There's some things we cannot change, and how do we live with these things? We're not going to be able to slow down the rate of change. How do we cope with that better? And in a similar way, I think we're not going to be able to stop the environmental crisis, but what can we each do in our lives to actually help that a little bit, and also improve the quality of our own life? So I think in the end, it always comes back to both the outer and the inner.